In this week's reading, we covered a significant amount of ground. Before we leave tonight, I want to take a moment to make sure we do not pass over what we have just walked through without pausing to recognize it. This is arguably the most theologically dense week in the entire program. From Matthew chapter 24 all the way through Acts chapter 4, days 71 through 77, we have covered the Olivet Discourse, the Passion narrative across all four gospel accounts, the resurrection, the Great Commission, the Ascension, Pentecost, and the birth of the early church. Let's walk through what that means. We opened the week on the Mount of Olives. Jesus and his disciples had just left the temple, and the disciples were marveling at the grandeur of its stones. Jesus stopped them with a stunning word. Not one of those stones would be left upon another. Then, sitting on that hillside overlooking Jerusalem, he taught them about what was coming: wars, persecution, false prophets, the great tribulation, and ultimately the unmistakable coming of the Son of Man in power and glory. This moment is what we refer to as the Olivet Discourse, this teaching on the Mount of Olives where Jesus speaks about what is to come. And it draws directly from the language of Daniel, Isaiah, and Ezekiel, the very prophets we have been reading together over these past weeks. The disciples asked when these things would happen. Jesus answered, "Stay awake. Be faithful. You do not know the hour." Then we entered what is known as the Passion narrative, the account of Jesus' arrest, trials, crucifixion, and death. And we read it 4 times, once through each gospel writer's eyes: the arrest in the garden, the trials before the high priest and before Pilate, the crown of thorns, the cry from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The torn veil in the temple, the burial in the borrowed tomb. If you felt the weight of those pages, that is the right response. You were meant to. But then came Sunday morning. Each gospel tells the resurrection differently, with different witnesses, different moments, different emphases, but they all point to the same truth: he is risen. John adds the restoration of Peter on the beach, the man who denied Jesus 3 times, being asked 3 times, "Do you love me?" "Feed my sheep." Then Matthew closes his gospel with what we call the Great Commission, Jesus' instruction to go and make disciples of all nations. "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, and I am with you always, to the end of the age." That is where everything begins to move outward. Then we crossed into Acts. Jesus ascended, but before he left, he gave a promise that the Spirit would come. The disciples returned to Jerusalem, and they waited together in what we often refer to as the upper room. They prayed, they remained unified, and in that waiting, Matthias was chosen. This was not inactivity, this was preparation. And then came Pentecost, the moment when the Spirit was poured out on the believers. Wind, fire, languages that had never been learned. Peter stood up, the same Peter who had been too afraid to admit he knew Jesus weeks before and preached from the prophet Joel and from the Psalms of David. 3,000 people came to faith that day. This was not just growth, this was the birth of the church. And in Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47, we see what the early church looked like, what we could call the pattern or marks of the early church. They were devoted to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. They sold their possessions. They shared with anyone who had need. They met daily in the temple courts and in one another's homes. Then we see Peter and John at the temple gate, a moment that leads into their first direct opposition. A man who had been unable to walk was healed. Peter spoke again, this time in Solomon's portico. And then they were arrested. They were brought before the Sanhedrin. And Peter, the same Peter who once denied Jesus, now stood with boldness and declared that there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. As we step back and look at everything we read this week, what becomes clear is that this is not just a series of events. It is a progression. Jesus prepares. He gives himself. He rises. He sends. He empowers. And the church begins. The arc of week 12 shows us that the kingdom does not come the way anyone expected, but it does come. The disciples were watching for power and glory. What came first was a cross. The women were preparing to mourn. What met them was an empty grave. The disciples were waiting in fear. What entered the room was fire. Again and again, God moved in the direction no one was looking. And if we are honest, that is often where he still moves. As you go into your sacred hour, sit with that. Not just what happened, but what it reveals about God, about people, and about how we respond when he moves. Looking ahead to next week, our reading will take us from Acts chapter 5 through Titus chapter 3. We will continue through the growth of the early church, the spread of the gospel beyond Jerusalem, and the letters that begin to guide and strengthen these growing communities of believers. We are now just 2 weeks from completing the entire Bible together. What you have accomplished is not small. You have walked through the law, the history of Israel, the Psalms, the prophets, and now the full sweep of the New Testament Gospels and the opening of Acts. Remember, every minute you give to God is forming something within you. Keep reading. Keep listening to God's voice. Allow the word to do its work. Stay sacred to your sacred hour.